if you've gone to places like Les Select, if you've gone to GT Prime, if you've gone to Mamatero, if you've gone to Boka, which is 13 consecutive years Michelin. But prior to all this, that's amazing. But walk us through, who was Kevin as a child? What did your parents do?
Yeah, so my mom was one of 14 kids who grew up on a farm, to understand my mom. So at age 6, she was part of farm labor, getting up at 4:30 in the morning. Rough childhood. My mom worked for Montgomery Ward, just like on the shipping docks at the mall. My dad worked at a little tiny insurance company. We, a family of 4, grew up in a 700 square foot house. Nothing to do with the restaurant business, and worlds away from fine dining or fine food. The kind of food I ate at home was, white rice with ground beef and Campbell's cream of mushroom soup poured on top. I mean, we did not have a gourmet house. But for some reason, I think because we weren't fancy, I was intrigued with stuff that was. And so there's a lot of TV icons at the time that, like, I really liked Jack Tripper a lot, and Jack Tripper was a chef on Three's Company. And so I think that might have been first. And then, Rick on Magnum PI had a bar. And so I saw those little things, but I was also like, I watched Dynasty and I'm like, why is Alexis Carrington eating caviar? That looks amazing. And so I remember going to a buffet on Mother's Day and there being oysters and all these interesting things. I was probably 12 or 13 years old, Southern Air restaurant. And that was like the fanciest dinner we'd ever gone to ever before. And I was hooked from that. And then I started watching food shows on TV and looking at cookbooks and telling my parents I wanted to open up my own restaurant, even though I didn't know really what that meant.
And, because sometimes you hear stories of people that were very fortunate backgrounds. Maybe their parents were tech CEOs or they had a lot of money that helped fund it. What's interesting about your background is, based on what you just said, with your parents coming from sort of blue collar, just average, middle income workers, you didn't necessarily have that funding or support, right? No,
I, was helping finance myself through college. And then, my story really is I'm at school and I was surrounded by a lot of people who knew exactly what they wanted to do. I was pre-law, not really that excited about it. And, I had 2 housemates that became legends. One, Mike Hopkins, was the commander of the SpaceX mission, but before that was the last American astronaut in space in the NASA program. And then the other Pulitzer Prize finalist, Dave Eggers. And Dave was giving me shit one night about, you don't want to be a lawyer. And I'm like, you're right, I actually don't. And he goes, well, what do you really want to do? And I'm like, well, it's kind of cheesy. It was 1989, restaurants weren't as cool as they are now. And he's like, well, what is it? And I go, well, I kind of want to open up my own restaurant. And he goes, well, why aren't you doing that? And I go, I don't know. I don't know anybody who does it. I don't have any money to open up one. And he goes, Kevin, Mike thinks he's going to be an astronaut. I was like, touche. And so, just several months later, I dropped out of college. I convinced myself, you know what? I'm going to go work for a legitimate restaurant. And the only problem was I didn't know what a legitimate restaurant was, and I didn't know where it was. So if I was smart, I would have gone to Chicago or New York or San Francisco or New Orleans or these great restaurant cities. I went to the Panhandle of Florida. I thought, you know what? Tourists, and it's right on the water, and fresh fish. That was my rationalization. I ended up in Panama City, couldn't get a job. Ended up homeless for a little while.
Homeless?
just for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, wow.
Lived in my car.
How old were you?
And I was 19.
And living in your car at 19?
Living in my car at 19. And then got a room at a boarding house. I was working at an amusement park. And then I wrote a fake resume. And I talked my way into a server's job at the Beach House restaurant in Panama City, Florida. And that changed my life.
So how much were you making?
At the amusement park, $4.25 an hour.
Okay.
But when I go into the Beach House, I remember one of my first shifts, I made like $140. And I'm like, you got to be fucking kidding me. This is amazing.
Yeah.
But I was most intrigued by the people that were working in the restaurant. I was like, these people are kind of brilliant, and they're a little bit dangerous. They knew a lot about food and wine and music, and film and life, and they were interesting, and they stayed out late, and I just dug the culture. When the pandemic came about, I remember talking to a lot of politicians who didn't understand who the people in restaurants were. And it's a really interesting group of people for people who aren't in the restaurant business. You have a lot of people in the back that are these true artisans who've, put their heart and soul into cooking. And they're kind of trying to win a lottery ticket, and some do. I work with some that have. Stephanie Izard, for one, who we have 8 restaurants with, who's struck gold in the restaurant business. But in the front of the house, it was a mix of people who were doing it for life because they really wanted to take care of people, but also people that were like trying to be a musician or trying to be an actor or that sort of thing. And it was this brilliant melting pot of just cool people that were really fun to be in a foxhole with, and then really fun to drink tequila with afterwards. And so I was making money, and I was interested. I was focused on something for the first time in my life. So I went looking for like a purpose, and actually what I found was like a community and a home. So that group of people at the beach house became like my first restaurant family. And I met my second business partner at that restaurant, and I met my girlfriend, who was my first business partner at that restaurant. So
that same restaurant.
And the woman who owned it, Alice Masker, was my first mentor. So it was kind of everything to me at that point.
And so, one of the reasons we have this mentorship platform is because of the fact that a lot of people, Gen Zs, 20, 21, 22, feel like it's tough to get mentors, or feel like it's tough to go and ask someone like you at where you're at in your business life now to mentor me, because, they look at it like, what can I provide for that person? So how did you go about getting her as your mentor?
Well, you're not going to know the answer if you don't get the question, if you don't ask the question. And most people, like, I very rarely say no if somebody asks me for a cup of coffee. I mean, sometimes my life's too crazy to do that. But
even now at the Pinnacle.
Even now, when people ask me, hey man, can I have 15 minutes with you? I'm like, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Let's go. But Alice wanted everybody in that restaurant to be better. And I probably was annoying at some points, but I just wanted to know everything. I'm like, how much does that sandwich unit cost there? Why is that like that? Or, how do you check out at the end of the night? How do you keep track of all this stuff? And how much of the tips have to go on the check? I mean, like, I kept a binder, and I just started asking questions as I would walk through a restaurant each night. I was like, what are the things that I don't know that I'm going to need to know when I own a restaurant? Fortunately, she always answered my questions.
Yeah. And it's sort of this concept of polite persistence, right? You walk a fine line with it. So
you do.
Tell us, how many years did you spend there before transitioning into the next venture or launch?
Well, I worked 6 doubles a week. And so for, a couple of years, and I used to shove my money into envelopes. So one job was my money that I lived off of, and the other job was the money that I was saving up to open up my own restaurant. So I would shove money into an envelope, and I would lick it, and I would seal it. And at the end of the week, I would take my 6 envelopes, and I'd rip them open, and I had a passbook savings account. For those of you that are not as old as I am, you go into the bank, and they would actually stamp your balance on a little book. And I had a certain number in my mind of what I was going to open up my first restaurant with. And so I just kept working until I hit that number. And, 2.5 years later, it was time to give notice at both those restaurants. And I hadn't done a lot of talking about it. I hadn't, said like, oh, I'm going to open up my own restaurant. I was kind of doing it quietly. And myself and my girlfriend, we took off, went to Seaside, Florida, which was like 70 miles away. It's now 30A. The road it's on is iconic. It's like, New York Times is a huge story on Alice Beach. It's the hottest real estate in Florida. It's but at the time I was the 10th restaurant on that road. There's probably 800 restaurants now. And we went out there and opened up the world's most modest restaurant, stuck together with bubble gum and Scotch tape. And it was called the Lazy Days Cafe. I was restaurant 1. She was the chef. We did everything. We washed every dish, waited on every table. I would set up garde manger and do salads. She would do all the hot food. It was a trip, man. It was a trip. One of the lines from my journal that I kept was, I'm not sure if this restaurant will ever fill my pockets, but it sure as hell fills my soul.